Well, thank you to IWP for letting me do this. Represents a lot of hours that I spend sitting in the basement reading through old FBI indictments and affidavits and criminal complaints of a lot of cases to try to put together an understanding of some of the methods that are being used by particular groups and agencies to conduct industrial espionage. It's a huge problem, and so this represents a lot of the research that I did at IWP. I am by no means an expert on any element of the Chinese military or the way they conduct espionage. This is just a brief portion of some of the things that I've studied. There's a lot of experts here at the Institute that helped me along the way, and experts at where I interned that have guided me through this, so thank you to all of them, and thanks for being here. So first, all warfare is based on deception. This is a big philosophy for Chinese industrial espionage. And it's good to always start a presentation with a Sun Tzu quote. The next quote is that the value of any PowerPoint briefing on China is inversely proportional to the number of Sun Tzu quotes. So I'm going to try and adhere to both of these. And Mulvaney's third law comes from this book, Chinese Industrial Espionage, recently published the last couple of years, and an excellent resource if anyone's interested in learning more about this topic. They have a very exhaustive study into how technology acquisition and the modernization of Chinese militaries happen through industrial espionage. So just to quickly outline some of the threats facing industrial espionage, this isn't just to private corporations getting their tech stolen. This represents threats to the competitiveness of the United States as private corporations try to innovate and develop new technology and intellectual property. This hurts the competitive edge that any business has on a global scale. It's a threat to the supply chain. There was a case a decade or so ago that some subcontractors were shipping Cisco routers directly from the plant in China to US military bases, and those routers were compromised. So industrial espionage doesn't just affect the tech, it affects the supply chain and the critical infrastructures that go along with it. Not just stealing innovations to critical infrastructure, but if some of the technologies are stolen, how these critical infrastructures are run, like SCADA systems or the alarm systems in Texas that went off, the raid signals went off in Texas, like the tornado warning systems. If some of those types of systems and alarms and warnings are compromised through reverse engineering or espionage of the actual tech, it's a threat to our critical infrastructure. The Ukraine critical infrastructure attacks, I mean, these are all big issues, and they're conducted not just by the traditional espionage forces being sent out to collect these things, but through industrial espionage and some innovative techniques that the Chinese government is utilizing. The IP Commission report was originally written in 2013 to kind of assess some of the threats and damages to the United States as far as intellectual property theft is concerned. And the update in February 2017 estimates that we have had $1.2 trillion in economic damage just in that window of when the two reports were written. So not a small issue. This is just kind of a brief overview of some of the ways that this is actually conducted. Reverse engineering, so Huawei and ZTE collecting old phones, buying up properties, buying up other companies to reverse engineer the tech. Theft of source code through insider threat or directed agents, which is largely what I'm going to talk about in these cases that I'm going over today. Insider knowledge, and Weipeng, that's the case that I'm actually going to cover today. Hacking or compromise with the Cisco routers, illegal exports. OmniNew was a case just a couple years ago. Presumption of denial is a legal term that describes companies overseas that any export is presumed denied to those companies. And so we see a lot of export violations going to those companies, even though there's a presumption of denial. Company acquisitions, a lot of times these are legal, that a company will just buy out a US company that maybe has sensitive contracts or has previously developed sensitive tech, so they'll legally just acquire them. Academic collaboration through conferences or universities or DARPA research grants that are producing some of our next military technology or next industrial control systems. So if those research grants and academic development is compromised from the beginning, then the entire project is no. So just a brief overview. Quickly just talking about the ideology in the People's Republic of China that helps us understand why this is being conducted. A quick example of this, when I was studying in China, the first thing we did when we got over there was, I want a fake Rolex. It's what you buy in China, right? So we go to some markets and we said, where's the fake stuff? And they said, oh, we don't have any. So we thought, well, we must just not know the correct word to say what we want in Chinese. So we went and asked some students, how do we say fake Rolex? Like describing what we want. So we went back and still nothing. 2 or 3 weeks later, we found out that there had been an Apple executive touring some of the local markets there to see if there were fake Apple computers, because that was part of the trade agreement, was that the government clamped down on those. So they did. Everybody just clamped down for a little bit, waited until the Apple executive left, and then later in the semester, I went and bought myself a fake Rolex. So, also, while I was in China, we had the opportunity to meet with some government officials, just local, state-level people. And I, being 21, I thought I can ask any question I want. So I said, why does China steal U.S. intellectual property? Why? And he said, well, the Chinese invented paper, and I don't see you paying us a royalty. So it kind of opened my eyes through that experience of, firsthand trying to look for pirated goods, and also hearing them just kind of blanketly state that this is the way things are done. It's just a different worldview. One of the key elements in understanding this is Chinese characteristics. A lot of the modernization of Chinese society is going through taking different elements and infusing with Chinese characteristics. So democracy of Chinese characteristics with the special administrative regions in Hong Kong. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, which includes opening some capitalist market abilities during the Deng Xiaoping era. And then the Chinese dream is even a modernization and a chance to a chance to work to fulfill the dreams, contribute to the revitalization of the nation is what they're trying to do, but with the Chinese characteristic. Another thing this follows off of is the century of humiliation in China, which was the period of roughly 1840 to the 1950s, when China really saw itself as being taken advantage of by imperialist nations. And now, coming out of that, this is a chance to redeem from that century of humiliation. So, to help them accomplish this, China engages in 3 warfares. So this is some Chinese military thought, and like I said, if you have questions about more details than Chinese military thought or strategy, there's some excellent experts who can help with that. But just a brief overview, this is 3 ways they're engaging in those. Shaping public opinion, influencing decision makers, or shaping the legal context of their actions or lawfare. This is particularly noticeable for industrial espionage because one of the main tactics they're utilizing is co-opting, or taking people that are not necessarily intelligence officers or trained collectors, but using them to cooperate with intelligence security services. So, as of July 2017, under China's national security law, Chinese nationals that are overseas at universities or work in private corporations are required, even if they have no affiliation with the Chinese government, to cooperate with intelligence services. Voice of America has done some great investigative reporting on people's families that have been pressured, either low or high, when the person that's overseas doesn't cooperate. So we see this a lot with student dissident groups. There was actually a case at the University of Maryland where some either Tibetan or Uyghur separatist groups or Falun Gong had started groups to try and promote what they wanted to, and there were actually Ministry of State Security Chinese intelligence agents at University of Maryland that got kicked back to China because they were trying to break open the whole ring. So very active in co-opting people that are not normally. So that's a brief overview of some of the ideology that fuels this drive, and also some of the legal context and methods they're engaging in for this. So some of the quick challenges for the United States to get a handle on that 1.2 trillion that's being lost in economic is the legal environment that we face here is, in my opinion, from my studies, pretty strict. It's pretty difficult for our agents to make a case, they have to go through pretty stringent methods to prove, especially with economic espionage, prove actual direction and involvement from a foreign government. And a lot of times that's difficult. With co-optees or people that are not trained intelligence officers, you don't necessarily see the hand of the Chinese government clearly apparent. Also, a lot of the times these cases are broken open through export violations or just theft of trade secrets, or even worse, the company will discover that they have something within their company, that they're leaking trade secrets, and they just fire the individual. And none of this ever gets brought to light, and that person maybe just gets a new job in the industry. And so that brings me to the second point, which is cataloging. We don't have, in the United States, a central repository for this, at least an unclassified forum for citizens like me to look at. So most of my research has been in the things that have been declassified or written like books, or through court cases, federal court cases. You can go and look at these actual indictments that are written and look at the back and forth and some of the testimonies of the agents that went and actually made these arrests. So difficult to put it all together. The other challenge is that private corporations don't necessarily know how to deal with the threat. As I'll show in the case study, they continue to build more and more robust security measures, but don't really engage in anything proactive or what would be counterintelligence to prevent it from happening in the first place. They just build bigger and bigger walls. And it's not effective. So this is highlighted by a survey the FBI conducted in private companies. 95% of those attempts to breach companies originated from people associated with the Chinese government, and over 80 companies claimed they had been victims of economic espionage. You know, how many of those 80 were actually reported or prosecuted? More challenges. A lot of private contractors or DoD umbrella things like DARPA research falls under defense security services that will go and actually run some of these security measures, but a small tech startup or a robotics company or a farm agricultural engineering firm don't have these umbrella protections. And so it's on them to take care of it, and the federal government doesn't have the resources to cover every small and medium-sized company. Directed threats will not register on some of our insider threat techniques. So a big trend in the industry is identifying maybe negative emotions that employees are typing, like, you know, resentment towards the company. But a directed person or a co-opted person isn't going to demonstrate that they have any sort of bad feelings towards the company. They're going to fly under the radar of some of these, you know, advanced emotional intelligence things that we're developing. So some real challenges. And also in the United States, we have a little bit of a silo mentality that different agencies have different jurisdictions. And so this issue in particular falls under both a legal issue and an intelligence issue. And so it's a difficult one for us to solve. So the purpose of this research is to kind of understand what's happening and then propose maybe some solutions for private companies to help themselves. So on a high level, I think that the Chinese intelligence operations form as more of a network instead of a siloed directly, this is my jurisdiction, I'm engaging in this. So you have the Ministry of State Security, which is an analog to a foreign intelligence collection agency. The People's Liberation Army, which is top right, which is the military, also engages in cyber. The Communist Party, which directs a lot of these. And then programs such as the High-Tech Research and Development Program, or Project 863. This was actually disbanded a couple of years ago, but was definitely in play during the case study. What I'm going to go over, it really emphasizes the fact that that's not a civilian intelligence agency, it's not a military agency, it's a research and development program, and it's directly utilized by all of these to gather co-optees and send agents to collect this information. So this is the interwoven network, and we're going to see one example like this in the wild. So this is a broad overview of how collection requirements are actually established. The Chinese Communist Party and the National People's Congress, which is the governmental aspect of it, set 5-year plans where they really dictate, this is where we want to go, this is what we want to develop, this is what we want to do. The most current one we're in is a 13th 5-year plan, and that goes over all of the development projects they want, and they implement those through different initiatives. So I'm sure you've heard in the news, Made in China 2025, or the One Belt, One Road initiative. And those are development projects that help to actually accomplish those collection requirements that are more broadly set out. So this is a rough breakdown that kind of takes into account the special targets for the 13th 5-year plan are broad categories, nuclear power. But on the right, the 863 program or Made in China 2025 break down some of those into specific collection goals. So with robotics on the bottom right, bearings is one of the things we're looking at, or high-end CNC machine tools. So if you're a private corporation that is producing a new bearings technology or a new biological 3D printing tool, you are going to be a target. This is their collection requirements. So this is all publicly available. They publish this on their People's Congress websites when they produce their 5-year plans. This is where they're going as a nation. So not to diminish any of the internal research and development they're doing at all. A lot of smart people all over the world are building new technologies, but a portion of it that isn't their own research is the real problem that we're facing. We don't need to go through all these. These are just a smattering of case studies all in the last 2 years of private corporations that have been victims of industrial espionage. And bolded is some of those illegal exported. They hosted a delegation of visiting scientists and found that they had rice in their luggages as they were leaving, so they could reverse engineer it. So a lot of different ways this is being accomplished. So the case study I'm going to go over covers 2 cases from Avago Technologies and Skyworks, which are communication companies. Both, I think, are located in Massachusetts. And this indictment is public record, so you can read through all of it, and I'll show a screenshot of that later. But the real object of this conspiracy was Tianjin University, in connection with government sponsorship and funding, was attempting to recreate and reproduce technologies developed by these 2 companies at a factory in China and beat them to market, and then undercut their prices and put them out of business. And they largely succeeded. We'll go over. So this is the indictment or affidavit, and this comes from the Northern District of California, which is a great location to look for a lot of these cases because it's the main hub of traveling in and out of the United States. So, as you can see, it's 32 counts of economic espionage, theft of trade secrets, conspiracy to commit, or aiding and abetting. So this is a big case. A lot of different tech was stolen. It's a ring of 6 people. Yeah. So to start, on May 16, 2015, the main conspirator in this case was arrested traveling back to the United States on a 32-count indictment. So the other 5 were not arrested, just 1. The other 5 are in China at Tianjin University. So the 2 main people in this is Wei Peng and Hao Zheng. Hao Zheng is the one that actually was arrested. They received their PhDs in the United States. They received their undergrads in China. And immediately after working on their PhDs in thin film bulk acoustic resonators, they went to work for Avago or Skyworks. So this is highly technical. I have no idea what it does, but it's basically communications, so ways for cell phones to be able to communicate back and forth or filter out sound frequencies. So high-tech developments by private corporations in Massachusetts. Interesting to note that both of these, when they were doing their PhDs, were conducting DARPA research, so funded by the Department of Defense and likely classified, if not, definitely military dual use. So could be used for cell phones, but can be used for military applications as well. After earning their doctorates, they accepted employment with the 2 companies. Immediately after, so less than a year after for one and just over a year after for the other, they began preparing business plans and soliciting universities in China to manufacture this exact technology in China, immediately after getting a job in the United States. And you can see this is 8 or 9 years before they're arrested. So this was not, they suddenly decided to be an insider threat and they felt malice towards the company and they stole some things. This was intentional, directed. So the object conspiracy was to set up an unauthorized fabrication facility in the PRC. And actually the way this was even discovered is the CEO of Avago or Skyworks was in China and said, this is our tech. Wait, I'm on a tour of my own facility. How did this happen? And that's when the case began to unravel. So this overview that we're walking through is going to show kind of the interconnected play between the co-optees, the academic research, and also the intelligence agencies. So this is one of the really key points, is that PRC government funding came through the 985 project, which that's just like the 863 program. There are research and development funds that go to specific collection goals, and a lot of times those fundings are guided through the MSS, which is the intelligence services. And so they were coordinating with that funding group to actually collect the specific requirements that the Chinese government has. Chinese government gave them express support and even opened up a high-tech development industry in Tianjin for them to build this plant. So it was great job, guys. We're going to open up a new development park. We're going to build a building for you. Awesome. In 2008, officials from Tianjin University flew to meet with Pang and Zhang, and they agreed to open up a joint facility. So after soliciting them, they got the funding, they got government approval, they got put through. Tianjin University provided them with details, plans, and equipment that they would need, including staffing requirements, and noted specifically in their collection to tell them what needed to be kept confidential. So Skyworks and Avago Technologies had specific technologies that it was confidential, you could not share. And so Tianjin University said, just make sure to let us know which ones are confidential so that we can be careful. Tianjin University and the Chinese government gave them a loan to set up a shell corporation in Cayman Islands, which they could launder all the stolen tech through and all the funding through. So systematic way for them to just transfer everything overseas. Wei Peng and others were co-opted due to their access and guided their collection requirements on this. And actually, as part of the affidavit, they walked through some of the communications between Wei Peng and Tianjin University, and he directly says back to them, I need to stay at Skyworks Technology long enough to master the technology, and then I'll join Tianjin University later. So he'd been given a specific collection requirement and said, I don't have access to this, and I don't know it yet. So let me stay on for another year, I'll get access, I'll learn it, and then I'll join you later. So none of that showed up on Insider Threat if they were running any programs, but none of that would show up because they're not writing the typical keywords and emotional things that we're looking for in some of the more technical aspects of keyloggers and things that companies are running. This is the 985 project mission that the PRC puts out. The Ministry of Education affirms the state universities have a role in bolstering the PRC economy, and this role may be more readily fulfilled by utilizing these funds. So the Chinese government believes that private citizens, educational institutions, all play a role in being co-opted in developing the government's development programs. So this is the methods that industrial espionage is conducted on. It's not a send a specific agent to go work at a university. It's send students overseas, send them to PhD programs, let them work in companies, and 10 years later, let's reproduce it and transfer all that wealth over on a massive scale. So this is a run through of all the security measures that Skyworks and Avago Technologies implemented to protect from their tech being stolen. Keycard badges, you had to have a password. All of their drives where they house all their tech on had separate passwords, were given confidentiality warnings before they signed in. Initial access had to be given by the system administrator. The computer systems had security banners and warnings whenever they were opening something that was confidential. They were required to wear access badges in the facilities. They physically marked things confidential. Before they departed, like left for another job, they were given exit interviews to establish, make sure you're clear on what you can and can't talk about. They had forms entitled Information for Terminating Employees Regarding Restrictions, Standard Business Conduct. So a lot of security measures were implemented to try and prevent someone from stealing their stuff. And none of these detected a 10-year operation spanning 2 companies, 6 people, and actively being developed overseas. Because the focus was internal. The focus was, let's build a bigger and bigger wall and prevent against what typically would be considered an insider threat. So the point in showing all of these security measures they put in place is to highlight some of the challenges that private companies face. Private companies, as we talked about in the beginning, understand there's an issue, but don't necessarily know how to seek recourse or mitigate some of these risks. And the federal government doesn't put an umbrella over every cell phone communications company. So the outlook, this is from the IP Commission report that we looked at the beginning. American businesses have continued to confine their actions to defensive measures. So with a guided, organized, coordinated threat like this, it simply isn't going to be enough to have defensive measures. What that means is by providing access control badges or security logins or confidentiality awareness, it's not going to prevent this massive co-opted guided program. And something to mention is that I haven't seen it much recently, but in the past couple of years, a lot of publications have been talking about how Chinese espionage is conducted by 1,000 grains of sand, which is meant to mean that they have a giant vacuum and they scoop up everything that there is, and then analysts will go through at the end and try and break down what is relevant and what is not relevant. And it has sort of a connotation of these are unskilled, they're just massive collecting operations. The co-optees are just students that are collecting things. And it really fails to identify that this is not a random vacuum, and this is not random students. This is a definitely understood collection requirements to active collection, to producing of reports, to disseminating within their own community, and revising their collection requirements for the next 5-year plan. So it follows a very traditional model of how intelligence is collected, disseminated, reported. What's unique, and what I think is confounding to a lot of US-based private corporations, is that it doesn't follow the typical US or Soviet model of intelligence, which is someone is trained and they go in and they recruit agents and they gather their information, they send it back. It's a different model. It's co-optees, it's using universities, it's using academic exchanges, it's using lawfare, legal purchase of other companies. So I agree with the IP Commission report, but it's their opinion that the issue has not received the sustained attention and policy that it requires to fix this issue. So there's a very long policy discussion that could go on about what can be done by this. Some of the great things that the US community is doing to try and prevent against this is the FBI has a counterintelligence division that produces publications and videos to actually highlight these stories. So the Company Man is a video that actually walks through a company that had visitors from China to tour their facility that turned out to be there to actually try to collect on things. And walks through how private corporations can recognize what's happening and do something about it. So that's a success case. The Wei Peng and Hao Zhang case is not a success case. That case, 4 years on, April 6th, is still trying to set a trial date. So hasn't even entered trial yet. The other 5 are full professors at Tianjin University and run this facility. So Avago or Skyworks, one of them has been bought out by another company because they didn't have a lot of operating capital. The other one is still functioning, but has a critical portion of what they've been spending, hundreds of millions of dollars in R&D on get reproduced somewhere else. So yeah, there's definitely efforts. There's a lot of really smart, hardworking men and women in the intelligence community trying to protect private corporations, but from a fundamental standpoint, the United States does not engage in espionage on behalf of private corporations. It's something that we don't do, but a lot of other countries do. And I think that there's a lot of private corporations that don't quite grasp the fact that you may be a small to medium-sized communications company, but you're going up against the entirety of the Chinese government. if they want your tech, they're going to direct a co-opted mission to try and collect some of those things. And it's going to be an advanced, persistent threat, not a 1,000 grains of sand sort of mildly collecting against you. Yeah, so with that, like I said, I'm not an expert on any particular aspect of this, but I'm happy to take some questions if you have any about either this case or any other methods for industrial espionage. Yes?
The case you presented, in your opinion, what is the greatest lesson learned from that case?
The greatest lesson learned is the defensive measures, that company thought that their security policies were going to prevent this from happening. Legally, their insurance probably would have covered something like that because they've implemented all the measures that the insurance company says they need to implement. But it doesn't.
From a U.S. perspective,
right?
The lesson learned from that case, not a company perspective. What can the U.S. learn from that?
From a U.S. perspective, I think that from a policy standpoint, there needs to be a policy shift to teaching or helping private corporations to understand the threat and developing measures that would actually be successful. So for example, in that one, had they understood that the development project that was paying funding for Tianjin University was a known co-optee of the intelligence agency, they would have been more wary of any of those academic exchanges. And a lot of those things probably would have popped up on their insider threat radars if they had any. But since they were only looking at defensive measures, none of that even popped up. Yeah.
The Economic Espionage Act going in 1996, how many actual prosecutions has the federal government done under the Economic Espionage Act since then?
I'm not sure the exact number, but today there's only been one that went to trial and was actually convicted. So not a lot.
So not a lot of attention by the government.
Not a lot. I mean, like I said, it's difficult to prove a direct connection from an intelligence organization or prove government sponsorship. So a lot of these get prosecuted and actually gain convictions under export violations. But that's a much lower sentence, and it really doesn't alert the general public or the core systems that espionage is really what was being conducted.
So it seems like it would be valuable from a U.S. perspective to break down some of the barriers between our intelligence organizations and private companies and allow some sharing of information. Do you see that coming? Is there any movement in that direction?
Well, there's definitely active efforts by federal agencies to work with private corporations when they notice a threat to sit there and help them do that. Some of the difficulties are if a U.S. agency gains intelligence that something is happening to a particular private corporation, how do you make the ethical consideration that you're giving an unfair advantage to one company over another? So if you have two direct competitors and you're spying on behalf of one and not the other, then it's sort of the U.S. government playing favorites with a private corporation, which is a pretty big barrier within the United States. So definitely some efforts to work with those private companies, but as far as the United States fundamentally engaging on a holistic counterintelligence for their companies, not likely. Yeah.
Besides informative videos and maybe some tutorials that you suggested that some advisory boards, I assume probably FBI or maybe even DHS would provide for these private sector companies, do they have you noticed any proactive workshops, given that federal organizations have had experience with insider threats and would be, better positioned to identify them?
Yes, definitely. So the FBI will send out the Office of Public-Private Partnership, I think is what it's called, and they'll send them things that are not available for public release, but to those corporations that are affected, that's more direct information. Also, some of the State Department Defense Security will put out key trends in counterintelligence and identify some of the industries or businesses that are most targeted to bring some of that awareness to them more directly. But in my opinion, the emphasis really should be on the private sector, that since government is legally or not willing to be engaging in this, that it's really on the shoulders of private corporations or nonprofits to do educational pieces to really make awareness from a private standpoint. Because then, if a private company is consulting with one and helping them gain an advantage, there's nothing stopping any other company from hiring them as well. So, and that's kind of how we do things in the United States. Yeah. Yes?
The information collection is part of their culture, kind of like for decades and centuries, so they are good at it.
Yeah.
Now, through the Pentagon, it's been said that they've been infiltrating to universities, engineering departments, and whatnot. They are not so protected that they're private industries. I think they've been infiltrated already. That's number one. Number two, nowadays there's hundreds of dozens of Chinese students at Ivy League schools, Princeton and whatever, and who knows how many of those students are going to return to China?
Right.
So how many is going to stay?
Right.
Overstay. And they find a way to stay. So,
Yeah, I mean it's a big problem.
I forgot
I mean,
my question.
Part of the academic culture is that
I'm a Japan native U.S. citizen, so you know how Japan and China, you know.
Yeah.
You know the history, right?
there's a history of that.
You're right.
I think that a lot of the academic culture in the United States and around the world is that we want to share. If we have new scientific discoveries, we want to be open with academic discovery. So that's an issue, you know, that defense research projects may say, you know, only hire U.S. citizens for this research grant. And universities are reluctant to comply and may get around it in creative ways and hire foreign nationals because it's an open mindset. And not every Chinese student is going to be an agent. I mean, not by any means. I went to school with a lot of people from mainland China that are just here to get an engineering degree and go back to China or stay, and that's great. But I think an understanding of, while an individual student may not have malicious intent, the Chinese government has put laws on the books that if they fall into a position that they want to co-opt them, they have a lot of tools at their disposal to pressure their families to
You
do
know
that.
what I was going to say is that some of the fighter jets they have in China, the Pentagon people, they came out and said they resemble so much, just like ours. So where does that come from?
I mean, I'm not
And
familiar with any
they've done
fighter
it
jets, but
in 5 years, 10 years, boom, speedy. How can you do that?
Because they stole a terabyte of data from
Well,
Dopp
you know, it takes
on the F-35.
years and
they
years and
created
years
the-
to develop all
the
these fighter
J-13.
jets.
Currently, right now, we are the world power in terms of AI. How much do you think this espionage is going to have an impact in losing and shifting that balance of power?
huge. I mean, if they've identified that as being one of their main 5-year plan, One Belt, One Road technology initiatives, this structure is going to be put in place to not only fund their own R&D with their own smart people, but also to go out there and find anyone else that's doing it and bring it home to China. So huge. It's going to be huge. And so it's incumbent on private corporations that are engaging in this AI research to understand this issue and put measures in place to defend their own tech, not only for their protection and protecting their own business advantage, but on a holistic U.S. competitive advantage standpoint as well.
And as a follow-up, do you think that policy is the only solution?
No, I think policy would go a long way to fix. It would be a broad sweep. Policy would, but having private corporations or nonprofits or people that understand this go out and try and fix the industry is maybe going to be a slower way at it, but definitely a positive step.
So, thank you for speaking. I really understand the security threat. I understand that, but for me personally, it's a bit of a personal issue because I'm an Indian immigrant. My parents only became citizens about 4 years ago. That's when I became a citizen. And they're both scientists, and I saw firsthand that within their own companies and their own cultures, there was a lot of hostile work environment and racism. And the fact that they thought this kind of same mentality of, these are Indian nationals, there could be this kind of subversion. So how do we balance having, and I don't think personally that's fair, that you should have the Indian or any immigrants like that should deal with situations. How do you balance the security concerns with not having a hostile work environment where people feel safe in the workplace?
Yeah, good question. I'm not an expert on social justice or any hostile work environments, but from my own just personal opinion, I have an uncle was a German national, now a U.S. citizen, and works in nuclear development at a national lab. So, the stigma of a German working in a national lab for nuclear development is pretty high. And like I said, I have a lot of friends that were Chinese nationals studying. There's a professor actually that was formerly at George Washington University that runs statistics on FBI prosecuting Chinese nationals at a higher rate and claims that it's a racial prejudice. So I think the way we balance that is we look at the crime being committed and not the person committing it. That, we're not looking at Tianjin University because it's a Chinese university. We're looking at it because there's an indictment where we've actually got them this, you said that you were collecting and specifically asked for things that were classified, knew they were classified and shut up a shell corporation. So we look at you because of that. So motivation and pinning people based on the crime committed and not on who they are. I think it's a constant issue for law enforcement to have to balance. But from the law enforcement people that I've encountered, it's pretty ethical of just what's the crime being committed. They don't care who you are. If you're breaking the law, you break the law.
Sure, my concern not with law enforcement. I know they work ethically. My concern is that when these things get publicized, corporations themselves may not be held as responsible. The people themselves may take those remarks out of context.
Sure, proper education.
That's an issue as well.
Proper education for what the issues are and what to actually look for. And I don't think there's anything you can really do about people having a vendetta against a certain group of people. It's a pretty systemic issue. Yeah.
The individuals that pursued doctoral degrees in the United States, any evidence that they were co-opted way back in their undergraduate studies, and that was the origin of the plan, was that they would come get their doctorates.
With this
Does it
case,
go back
no.
that far?
With this case, no. With this case, the first evidence is after they received their doctorates and joined the company, they reached out. I have seen other cases that has been the case. But this one, no.
Identify young, bright, up and coming, and say, here's what we'd like you to do. Position
From the evidence I've seen, no, not really. It's more of once access has been granted, they identify those people. But I don't know. I mean, that's a big study that would be interesting to look at. Yeah.
In the cases you look at, co-optees actually recruit other employees in the company, or is it self-contained within their group of co-optees?
Typically self-contained. We rarely, at least from the cases that I've looked at, I rarely see them branching out to other employees, especially non-Chinese nationals, especially that are not from their hometown. So pretty self-contained. That's changing a little bit. There was a recent arrest of Kevin Lawrence, I think was his name, in Virginia. He was arrested for espionage for the Chinese that had been dragged into a circle by other Chinese nationals, but typically self-contained within those people that are co-optees.
So let's say that we've created the policy, we have the people in place to see to it that no espionage is being committed, but we're also building a huge case once we find out that the Chinese government has a distinct link between the people funding these shell corporations and being able to travel to and from the US. And we present it to them as look at what we found out that you've been doing all this time. What do they do? Do they care?
No, I mean, we indicted that whole group of cyber hackers, and they said, great, that didn't really diminish cyber hacking at all. So a nice gesture, but yeah, not super effective. I think the policy would be more to maybe put stricter requirements on private corporations that are producing dual-use goods that can be used for private military to enforce that they have a counterintelligence policy and not just a access control policy, so that they actually have to implement some of these techniques that would maybe put a dent in this instead of just wait for them to get hit and then insurance covers it. Another difficulty is that a lot of private corporations have some amount of risk built into their model. And so, if you're an investment firm and you have a certain amount of your investments that you realize are getting stolen by a corrupt group in China, but you also make a lot of money with them, you're not going to stop doing that. So some business challenges too. Well, thank you. This is great for me, so thank you all for coming.